Welcome back to the NT Podkast, Science and Theology podcast. My name is Nemanja Jurišić. Today I'm joined by renowned archaeologist and biblical scholar, Dr. Lawrence Geraty. Professor Geraty, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. We'll take a closer look at your archaeological work at Heshbon and the Madaba Plain project. So that's our topic today. And let's get started. But first, Professor Geraty, please tell us something about you and your background for people that don't know you well.
Well, I grew up in China during World War II, behind Japanese lines. My parents were missionaries there. And when the communists came, they had to be transferred out of the country, and they were sent to Lebanon. And so I spent my teenage years in Beirut, Lebanon. And I suppose that's where I got my interest in archaeology, because traveling around to sites of biblical interest, I watched archaeologists at work. I visited the Qumran caves during the time that they were being excavated by Father DeVoe. And so I went from Lebanon, I went to college in England, Newbold College, and then on to the seminary, Adventist Seminary in Michigan. And I studied with Siegfried Horn, who is sort of known as Mr. Archaeology in the Adventist Church. And when he was starting his project at Heshbon, first in 1967, on June 5, it was supposed to begin, but that's the day that the Six-Day War began. And so, of course, the dig had to be canceled, and we began actually in 1968. And for the first 3 seasons, I was in graduate school at that time at Harvard, studying with Frank Cross and Jurišić Wright. But I helped Siegfried get started. Actually, before that, my first archaeological experience was with Bill Deaver at Gezer, a couple of seasons. But back to Siegfried Horn at Heshbon. We worked there for the first 3 seasons, and then he became the dean of the Adventist Seminary in Michigan and was too busy to conduct the work, so he asked me to take over. So I completed the work at Heshbon, Tel Heshbon, and we found excavation results back to around 1200 BCE, which didn't go back as far as we had expected in terms of the biblical account of what happened at Heshbon. So we thought, let's stay in the same area and work at another possible site where we expected the results to go back earlier than at Heshbon, and that was at Jalul. And we had permission, but then it was taken away from us because of political reasons. And we said, okay, let's go to Tel El-Umairi, which is not too far from Heshbon. It also had material going back much earlier into the second millennium BCE. And so while we were working at Umairi, the government said, by the way, Jalul is available again to you if you want to go there. So we worked at both sites simultaneously. And then during that time, I was invited to become an administrator. It's a difficult decision for me whether to stay in academics and stay in the field or to get involved also in academic administration. So for various reasons, some of which were political, I decided I would leave Andrews and became the president of a little Adventist college in Massachusetts. And after 8 years there, I was invited to La Sierra University, where I completed my career, retiring in 2007 after 14 years at La Sierra. So while I started during my academic administration to also direct the project in Jordan, it soon became evident that that was unfair to both, places. And so I turned over the directorship of our Umeiri project to Larry Herr and Doug Clark, who both have recently retired also. And then Øystein LaBianca, who's still at Andrews, although retired there. He started up the work at Heshbon again because he was very interested in the Islamic period. And we have excellent Islamic remains. So I've continued my interest and support for these projects, but gradually through time, I got more and more involved on my campuses here in the United States and haven't been able to pay as much attention, to the dig sites. Although I've been involved, especially in the publication of our results at Heshbon. We have 10 or 12 large volumes of material there. And the same at Umeiri. We have about 10 large volumes there. And I'm very, very dependent on the help of LaBianca at Heshbon and very dependent upon Doug Clark and Larry Herr for the publication of the final results at Umeiri. So you could say that I continue to dabble in archaeology, but I'm no longer the leader in the field that I think I once was because of my work in educational administration.
What a rich background. So you studied at Harvard University. I don't know many Adventists that studied at Harvard. Maybe Larry Herr, but not many. How is it to go with that background to that college? Is it challenging?
Yeah, it was. It was a privilege and an honor, I would say, to study with the people at Harvard. There's such rich resources at an institution like that and opportunities also. And I'm sure that it's because of my contacts that I made with classmates and professors and so on there that have given me many of the privileges that have come my way since. For 4 years, I was president of what was called the American Schools of Oriental Research, ASOR, now the American Society of Overseas Research. And I'm sure I would not have been given the opportunity to be president of that organization had I not gone to Harvard and made the contacts there and met the people that came my way there. So, yeah, it's an institution with incredible resources and a wonderful place to be in contact with people who are in the field. It's dismaying to me to see what's happening at that university right now with the American political scene. And I don't know what the future will hold, but I'm glad that Harvard is resisting some of the mandates that come from the Trump administration, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, so I'm really interested about still your background because I want to know more because it's really rich. Sorry, but we will later talk about Heshbon. So, how is it to be with Frank Moore Cross and other big names?
Yes. Frank Cross was intimidating to me at first because he's your typical erudite professor. And I remember being in a Ugaritic class, for instance, one time when he asked his students to vocalize Ugaritic with Arabic vowels. And so I was doing my best, and I was reciting a passage that way when he stopped. He said, "Hey, that's brilliant." He said, "Well, how did you think of that?" And I had no idea what I had done, you know. So I said it was accidental. Well, at the end of class, he said, "I'm going to be gone next week. Would you teach the class?" You know. And I said, "No, Professor Cross, I can't do that. You know, I don't feel like I'm a linguist at all. The languages had never come easily to me. But the philosophy at Harvard was you need to learn all these Semitic languages um, because in your digging you might uncover an inscription, and then you need to know what you're excavating, what they are." So I had exams in a dozen different languages and was proficient enough to be able to pass those exams, uh, but I never felt like I was uh, linguistically uh, really as capable as a person like Frank Cross. So George Ernest Wright was more like um, the kind of person that I became, I think. I mean, he was very interested in the Hebrew Bible, and his interest in archaeology was a result of his interest, you know, in the Hebrew Bible. And so he was as much a churchman and as a theologian, I would say, as he was an archaeologist. And so when it came to the techniques of digging in the field and so on, he was more of a field archaeologist than Frank Cross was. Frank Cross was able to read all the texts that archaeologists found. But the combination of having those two men as my primate professors was certainly a uh, very much of a blessing. You know, learned a lot from them both. Frank Ernest Wright, I would say, visited me in the field when I was directing the Heshbon project in 1974. That was in August, I believe, his visit, and he died that fall. So that was his last time to visit the Holy Land, 74.
Wow, so much to talk with you about that. But let's move on to our topic, Professor Geraty. This is first question, but it's related to our discussion. What is the current scholarly consensus on the historical reliability of Exodus account? You spoke on one conference about that, giving many views. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. The conference was in 2013 down at the University of California in San Diego. And my friend Tom Levy, who's a professor there, more recently he's retired, uh, helped organize that conference and asked me to give an introductory talk on Exodus dates and theories. And so, you know, I'm looking at some of my notes, and I can, you know, share some of the things that I said there. And I began with the traditional date in the 18th dynasty, the New Kingdom, um, which is I think, classic, um, you know, time for the Exodus. Although a more accepted view, I think, is in the 19th dynasty, a little bit later. And then there are many other views too of when the Exodus took place, if indeed it did at all. But if you look at the traditional date, that would be around 1450 BCE in the 18th dynasty, and it's based, of course, on 1 Kings 6:1, which says that in the 480th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So a very specific chronological datum. And most scholars would agree that the 4th year of Solomon would be around 970 BCE, plus or minus a year or two. So when you add 480 years to that number, you get around 1450, something like that, BCE. And that would put you in the New Kingdom's 18th dynasty, perhaps at the death of Thutmose III that year, or some have suggested Amenhotep II. And it seems to be maybe too good to be true. The usual critical response to this 480-year figure is based on the tradition that there were 12 generations of 40 years each between the Exodus and the United Monarchy. But modern scholarship suggests we know that 40 years is too long for a generation, and it's more like 25 years, perhaps. So if you multiply 12 times 25, that would be around 300 years. And when 300 is added to 970 BCE, that would take you back to around 1270 BCE, maybe in the 9th dynasty. But that would be for people who are trying to work with the figures in the Bible. Traditionalists would say that 1 Kings 6:1 is not the only chronological datum, because in Judges 11:26 we have Jephthah, the Gileadite judge, who is in a debate with the Ammonites, who are trying to retake the Madaba plains from the Israelites. And in response to the Ammonite argument that this territory really belonged to them, Jephthah, the judge in the book of Judges, says, hey, for 300 years, Israel has occupied Heshbon and Aroer and the surrounding settlements here along the Arnon. So why didn't you retake them during that time? I mean, we've been here as Israelites, for 300 years. So Jephthah, one of the so-called judges, is dated to around the 11th century BCE, traditionally around 1075. If you take Jephthah's round number of 300 years that the Israelites have been there and add them to his date of 1075, it takes you back to around 1375 BCE, since the Israelites have been in Transjordan, a date which fits the 1450 date for the Exodus, if you consider the generation that wandered in the wilderness before entering Canaan. So the conquest would be sometime after 1400 BCE. And the traditionalists point out that though it's a round number, 300 is not divisible by a generation of 40 years. So it had to come about in a different way. In other words, the figures in 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26 work together to suggest an exodus from Egypt around 1450. Does such a date work with the context of what we know about the New Kingdom's 18th dynasty? And some people say yes, and we could go into arguments for and against. But I would say that in that regard, Thutmose I fits as the pharaoh who proclaimed the death decree for all male babies. Would have come earlier in his reign, so it would not have affected Aaron, who was 3 years older than Moses. He moved his court to Memphis, where his daughter would have been in contact with the baby Moses. It's possible then that Hatshepsut would have been Pharaoh's daughter, who rescued the baby Moses, who would have grown up during the reign of her father, Thutmose I, and her husband, Thutmose II. And if Moses fled Egypt when he was 40, according to Acts 7:23, then it would have been late in Hatshepsut's reign. when her co-regent Thutmose III would have been able to assert himself. And she would also have been the pharaoh who would have died while Moses was in exile, according to Exodus 2:23. So we know about the death of Thutmose III in March, the time of Passover, around 1450 BCE, from the tomb biography of Amenemhab, who served in the Egyptian navy under several pharaohs. The cities of Pithom, and would later be called Ramses, cities built by the enslaved Israelites, would have been needed as store cities for the many expeditions that Thutmose III led into Asia. We could talk about the mummies that are in the Cairo Museum, who've been x-rayed and how they fit back and forth. So that kind of scenario, which I've just briefly described, is proposed by current advocates of the traditional date of the Exodus, around 1450. There's good evidence for a co-regency for Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. We know a lot about what happened during this time and their forays into Palestine. The dream stela of Thutmose IV that's in front of the Sphinx, that fits into the story. The Amarna letters, speaking about the Habiru, works in this kind of a situation. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence for the 18th dynasty. But there are many objections that have been raised to this traditional date. And the major objection is that the 15th century date for the Exodus would relate to the results of excavations at Palestinian cities. In the biblical account, cities like Heshbon, Jericho, Ai, Bethel, Debir, Gibeon. The site of Hatzor might be argued one way or the other, but the ad hoc explanations can be supplied for most of these sites, but there's no question that the archaeological evidence is inconclusive at best. And so I think that it would be fair to say that the consensus date for when the Exodus took place nowadays is the late 13th century BC and the 19th dynasty. And Pharaoh Merneptah Israel Stela, around 1220, fixes a date before which the Exodus occurred, since it mentions Israel as a people among nations that otherwise refer to places in Palestine. So Exodus 1:11 talks about the Israelites building the city of Ramses for the pharaoh of the oppression. And there are only two pharaohs before Merneptah, which bore that name, Ramses I and Ramses II. Obviously, there are several sets of competing chronologies for the New Kingdom, but I think the fairly accepted date is around 1280 to 1213, something like that, BCE. And Ramses' royal residence, P. Ramses, is located in the Delta. One time Tanis on the Tanaic branch of the Nile was thought to be P. Ramses, but the literary evidence relating to that site doesn't accord well with Tanis, and there's no architectural and stratigraphic evidence for its existence prior to the 20th dynasty. So since 1930, various studies have suggested, that Kantir might be P. Ramses. Tel el-Daba, Manfred Bitak, who you've talked to, has shown that the occupation of this site under the Middle Kingdom's 12th and 13th dynasties was brought to an end with a violent destruction. Maybe that fits into the story. We could talk more about Tel el-Daba related to the whole issue of when the Exodus could have occurred. But there are other reasons, too, that have been adduced to support this theory. The Egyptian tomb reliefs depict Apiru or Habiru working in the vineyards in the northeastern delta of Egypt. Ramses II's military campaigns into Sinai, Negev, and Transjordan. His treaty with the Hittites contains an unusual stipulation that incumbent on the Hittite king, in the event that Ramses' own subjects committed another crime against him, the Hittite king would have to come to his aid. George Mendenhall suggested that the similarities between the Hittite covenant treaties and the form of the Mosaic covenant could be most easily explained if Moses had been in Egypt during the 13th century BC. And so beyond these non-specific nature of these suggestions that I've made briefly here, some problems with dating the Exodus in the 13th century come when the history of the period is examined from the biblical point of view. These problems have to do with the pharaohs involved, who was the pharaoh of the oppression, who died while Moses was in exile, the pharaoh who died during the Exodus. And it has to be said that neither Seti I nor Ramses II work out well for the pharaoh of the oppression, nor do Ramses II or Merneptah work out well for the pharaoh of the Exodus. So there are a lot of other theories for the Exodus too, that in that talk that you referred to, I briefly referred to. The earliest theory goes back to the Middle Bronze I or Middle Bronze IV period. Primary advocates of that are Rudolf Cohen, Emmanuel Anati, David Nev, Kenneth Emery, David Alone. The archaeological period is correlated with the late Old Kingdom and the first intermediate period, with some advocates connecting the Exodus specifically with Pharaoh Pepi II, 6th dynasty. An early and old theory advocated by the chronographer Julius Africanus and the Roman-era Jewish historian Josephus put the Exodus in what we would now reckon as around 1700, based on the information known at that time about the Hyksos. Another theory takes advantage of what the volcanic eruption of Thera, Santorini, dated to the 16th century BC, did to the Eastern Mediterranean. And you have several individuals who be connected with that. But the date of the eruption and the Exodus at around traditional date has aroused all kinds of controversy due to radiocarbon dating, tree ring, ice core, so forth. And so this is not, I think, a theory that most people would be happy with. Manetho, the 3rd century BCE priestly historian who divided the Egyptian pharaohs into dynasties, believed that the Exodus could be equated with the Hyksos expulsion from Egypt. So some have looked at that. Archbishop Usher, the same individual who dated creation to 4004 BC, dated the Exodus to 1491 and suggested that Ramses II could be the pharaoh of the oppression. That was popular at that time, but it has been forgotten today. We've talked about traditional early date for the Exodus around 1450. Watzinger, Eric Peet, Siegfried Horn, Hans Gödecke were all people who looked seriously at that date. The traditional Jewish date of Rabbi Jose ben Halafta puts it in the 1313 BCE. There's a current consensus that a late date of 1250 BCE with Ramses or Merneptah is probably the most logical. Most scholars who give any credence at all to an historical exodus from Egypt usually come down on that kind of a date. So there are many theories regarding the Israelite exodus from Egypt that have been proposed. I've referred to, I think, most of the popular ones. But during that conference that we had, we had many of the key people who were interested in the Exodus there, and they all gave interesting papers arguing for one or another of the various, possibilities. But I don't know if that useful. I've tried to sort of summarize the kind of suggestions that were made in that paper that you referred to.
Oh, so many theories ranging thousands of years. So I had also Emmanuel Anati. He's still alive. He have, I think, 91 year.
Yeah.
He's great.
And
But
you've interviewed him, did you? Yeah.
yes, we talked about Harkarkom, Mount Sinai. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But
What
yeah,
did he
I'm not
say?
sure that.
I know a doctoral student named Deborah Hearn who is advocating Khartoum, and she's over in Israel now, doing further study with this, and has some very interesting, arguments.
Yes, I know one Egyptologist who bragged. I think he's from Holland, or so.
Uh-huh.
He says, okay, Karkom is a real Mount Sinai, but he goes with 13th century BC consensus date. So he combines those two. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. There, as far as the traditional Mount Sinai, it's it's really not a very good location. And I suppose that's why many people now look at Jebel al-Lawz or other places in Saudi Arabia, as possibilities. But I like the location of Khartoum because geographically it makes sense, but you can't find much around Khartoum that fits a good date for the Exodus. Most of that material that is there is a much earlier possibility. So I don't know. But you might, if you like that issue of the location of Sinai, you might ask Deborah Hearn to present her evidence for it.
Yes, Anati said that either this is a real Mount Sinai and Exodus happened in the 24th BCE, or
Uh-huh.
this is not Mount Sinai, so you can change her theory. Yeah, he's a really good guy. But yeah, you mentioned Secret Horn. Please, can
Yeah,
you tell me? I know that he troubles with those. You mentioned Usher's chronology. He
right.
said that you cannot fit all history in 6,000 years. So, can you please tell something more about it?
About Siegfried Horn. Uh, Siegfried Horn was grew up in Germany, and married a Dutch woman, and the Adventist Church sent him out to the Dutch East Indies as a missionary. And while he was there, World War II began, and when Germany overran Holland in a day, the Dutch were so upset at the Germans that they imprisoned all the Germans in what's now Indonesia, because it was a Dutch, colony at that time. And so he was imprisoned first in Indonesia, and then the Dutch turned their prisoners over to the British in India when the Japanese got close. So for 7 years, he was in a prison camp, and during that time, he studied with all the books that he could get a hold of, and came up with his history of Israel, and he studied all the archaeological books that he could find. And when he was freed from prison camp in 1947, he came to the US and was wanting to study with Albright at Hopkins. And Albright interviewed him, asked him to translate from the Greek New Testament, from the Hebrew Old Testament, interviewed him on various topics. He said, look, you're wasting your time here. You know everything that we could teach you at Hopkins. Why don't you go to University of Chicago and get a PhD in Egyptology, learn something new or different, you know? So that's why he went to Chicago and got his doctorate in Egyptology, and then was invited to teach with his old seminary professor, who at that time was teaching at the seminary. So the two of them made up the Old Testament department, and that's how he got interested in Egyptology. He wrote a dissertation on Egyptian evidence of various kinds, and he decided he wanted to get some excavation experience, and he made friends with George Ernest Wright and worked with him at Shechem. That's where his primary field experience came from. And it was during his time at Shechem that he thought, you know, I'd like to be responsible for my own dig. And that's why he got started with Heshbon in the 60s. So he the Adventist Church, I believe, owes him a lot because he was a man who felt you needed to follow the evidence. He was conservative in his views, but he said you have to admit that there's too much data, too much history to fit into 6,000 years. And so he didn't think it was possible to have a worldwide flood or fitting history into that period of time, that we had to take the evidence from archaeology and from the various age dating techniques developed by science, take that seriously. And he was responsible for the Adventist Bible Dictionary that is published, you know, by the Review and Herald, and he wrote the introductory articles for most of the commentary that the Seventh-day Adventist Church published, and he constantly urged in his writings and in his classroom teaching to be faithful to the evidence and to keep your mind open always to new discoveries and so forth. So I would say that he was a voice of reason and a scholarly, educated voice for the Adventist Church. And I certainly myself owe him a debt of gratitude for his guidance when I was getting started. Did you have, so that was something about Siegfried Horn. Were you also asking about Heshbon or
Yes,
no?
let's talk about Heshbon because we had many theories about Exodus. So after Exodus, can we agree that it's likely that it's 13th century BCE? So after Exodus, we have a Sihon Amorite king that lived in Heshbon by Deuteronomy 1:4, whom Moses defeated. So do we find something like that?
Yeah. That's the reason, of course, that Siegfried chose Heshbon. There were many different possibilities when he was wanting to find his site for excavation. There were logistical issues from one site to another, but Heshbon was on a new road that had just been opened up by the government, and it had a village where they had workmen who were willing to work for the expedition. And so the logistical reasons for going to the site, as well as historical reasons, because he was interested in the site. And we fully expected that we would find, the remains of an Amorite town there. But it became evident after 2 seasons of work that there was nothing before around 1200 BC, no evidence. there for anything. And so whether you have an 18th or a 19th dynasty, period, neither one fit well the beginning of human occupation at the site. And yet, the story of Sihon, the Amorite king, which is mentioned in the Pentateuch and Numbers, especially, and Deuteronomy, and then that episode, that story is referred to 20 times in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, it's a founding story that's important to the Israelites. So how to fit that story with the remains at the site has been a problem. Øystein LaBianca, who's at Andrews now, the anthropologist who came back to Heshbon because of his interest in the Islamic period, has done more work there. He and I are working on a volume summarizing our work at Heshbon, and chapter 3 of this book that we're working on is called Beyond Sihon, Decolonizing the Archaeology of Tal Heshbon and Reframing Biblical Narratives from Transjordan. That's the title of the chapter. And so we're trying to take seriously this tradition that comes from the biblical account and see how does it match with the archaeological and anthropological evidence that we found at the site. And it doesn't fit well, but I'm a kind of a person who wants to take seriously the biblical account and fit it into what we know archaeologically. So it's not easy, but we're making the attempt to do that. And it was because there was nothing earlier than around 1200 BC at Heshbon that we moved to Omeri and Jalul, where there is material. And so some people have said, maybe that's the site of Heshbon. Maybe it's at Omeri. And there are scholars today, who argue that. And others who say, Jalul is a better candidate. But back to 1200, the evidence that we found at Heshbon is good for what we find out later about the site. For instance, we did a regional survey around Heshbon, and on the road from the Dead Sea or the Jordan Valley up to the site of Heshbon, there's a Roman road, and it has milestones, and it has milestones to Heshbon, to Espus, the Greco-Roman name for the site. And so that's one piece of evidence. We excavated a large reservoir at the site, up at the top of the hill, a very unusual place. You'd think a reservoir would be at the bottom of the hill where it would catch, the water. But this reservoir at the top of the hill, when we excavated, it dates back to the 10th century. And so it was very tempting to connect that reservoir to the reference in the Song of Solomon. Solomon is describing his beloved, and he says, your eyes are like the pools at Heshbon by the gate of Bat Rabim. So we found this large pool. If it was full of water, sparkling in the sunlight, you could imagine it would be a good simile for his beloved's eyes, Then we found, a lot of interesting things from the Roman and Byzantine period. We had churches there that are identified as Byzantine Espus. So because the site seems to have good evidence as being Heshbon in the later period, but doesn't work well before 1200, we have to find a way to talk about historical memory of the site in later Old Testament Hebrew Bible times.
Yeah, fair enough. That's really honest, and I like your approach. So we should do like that. So, according to Oysten LaBianca and Bethany Walker, the
Uh-huh.
excavations found remains from the LBA and early Iron Age periods. Yes, we don't have anything from that, but they say intensive reuse of the site by later occupants resulted in most remains from those periods being found in secondary deposits. So, is it possible that there is explanation why we don't have anything before 1200s?
You know, uh, Oystein LaBianca refers to there are a few potsherds that might be 13th century, the late bronze or transition between the bronze and the Iron Age. But certainly nothing there are no structures to go with that at all. And so he likes to say that there's maybe the end of the Bronze Age evidence there. Uh, I'm not quite so sure, that a few sherds gives us the ability to talk about anything in the late Bronze Age being there. So he his field is anthropology, where he's an expert in all kinds of theoretical positions. I'm not an anthropologist, but I want to be honest with the archaeological evidence, So I think, in my view, we have to accept the fact that the site where we were working doesn't go back earlier than 1200. Now, you know, a few 13th century sherds around there might indicate that there were tent camps there. Maybe Sihon is a tent dwelling uh, Bedouin tribesman, and may have moved around with with depending on agricultural purposes and so forth. So I'm willing to consider all kinds of imaginary, ways of still hanging on to Heshbon as the right place for the biblical story, but it takes some explanation.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, about the pools of Heshbon, would you say it's built by Solomon, or is it something? Is it pools of other people, nations? When is the first sign in archaeology that we see that Israelites were there? Do we see something like that?
Yeah. Uh, I honestly don't think there's anything there that would compel us to say Israelites were there. Yeah. There's room for discussion and possibilities, but I can't present anything that we found that says this is Israelite. Yeah.
Do we
Uh,
find, for example, forum houses or pig bones or anything?
yeah, I mean, at Umeiri, which is nearby, the second site that we did after Heshbon, we have a wonderful example of a four-room house. In fact, it has become our painting of the evidence there is now published in many other, articles and encyclopedias and so on, because in many ways it has been argued that that's the best example of a four-room house. It comes from around 1250 or 1300, something like that. Um, so we have, but there's nothing in the evidence. There's no inscriptions, nothing that would argue that this has to be Israelites, though the biblical tradition is that this is the area of Reuben. And, when the Israelites came into Transjordan, God told them that they could not fight against their relatives. So the Ammonites and the Moabites were out of bounds. But they could take Heshbon because Sihon had already fought the Ammonites and taken Heshbon away from the Ammonites. So now it would belong to the Amorites because Sihon was an Amorite. And the Amorites were people who they go all the way up through Transjordan and Syria to southern Turkey. I mean, we're beginning to learn quite a bit about them. And Sihon was one of these Amorite chieftains. Because he had already fought the Ammonites and taken the land away from them, that gave Israel the right to take it from him, whereas they couldn't have taken it from the Ammonites. That's what it seems to suggest from the material. And so the tribe of Reuben was in that vicinity, the tribe of Gad just north of there, and half tribe of Manasseh, and then the other tribes went across. So you can fit the biblical story into the evidence that we have, but it's not anything that you can prove, I would say. Yeah.
Right, that's really honest. I again need to say I really like your approach. So thank you for this. And how do you comment this response from Bill Deaver? He says, quote, "The site was excavated in a large interdisciplinary project sponsored by a group of SDA scholars who perhaps intended to prove the biblical traditions of the Israelite conquest of the site. Much to their consternation, however, the town turned out to be founded only in the Iron II period, long after any supposed conquest. There were only a few scattered remains of the 12th or 11th century BCE pottery, but no architecture, and no trace whatsoever of occupation in the 13th century BC. The excavators resultantly published their results, however, and reluctantly concluded that something was drastically wrong with the biblical story about Heshbon." Yeah, so how do you comment this?
Yeah, I mean, it's close to the truth. I would say that we did find evidence from the 12th century. You know, he said 11th. Okay, we could argue about that. But he's right that we didn't find at the site the kind of evidence we expected to mesh our historical interpretation of the biblical story. So I think he he's basically right in what he says, but I would have small arguments. He's visited the site when we were excavating there. We're good friends. He's been to La Sierra University where we have the evidence, and he's lectured many times. So he has often said that the future of biblical archaeology lies with the people like us who try to take the biblical history seriously, but correct our views with what we actually find, and try to be honest with both.
Yes, but do we expect to find some city? Because Bible mentioned that Heshbon is city in the time of Moses, but the word city is large, and we can use it for even village or anything, region. So what do you think?
Yeah. There's definitely an interpretive problem there. But, when Nelson Glick did his survey in Transjordan in the 30s, he came to the conclusion that there was nothing there before the Iron Age. But since that time, we found lots of Bronze Age evidence. It just had not been noticed on the surface when Glick went through. So at Umeri, for instance, we have a temple from from the 13th and 14th century. I mean, a very impressive temple that stands, 5, 6 feet high. I mean, the walls. So we have late Bronze Age in abundance, and Amman, we have another temple, from the late Bronze Age. So uh, Glick was wrong in that interpretation that there was nothing in the Bronze Age. We found lots of Bronze Age, but unfortunately, not at the site of Heshbon. Yeah, but people existed definitely in the late Bronze Age there.
Yes, so is it possible that we just didn't find until now, but in future maybe we will recover something from that period?
Yes, yes. You never can say never because we're always surprised by the finds that are made in archaeology, and I think it is possible because there was a time in archaeological research when it was thought there was nothing in Transjordan at all. And now we know that there is plenty of late bronze remains in Transjordan. So yeah, we we can't say never.
Yes, famous Kenneth Kitchen. I really adore his work. So he
Right.
said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So yeah.
Agree with that. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so after 1200s, what we find in Hesbon, who lived there, what was the life like? I don't know, until the, yeah, Iron
Well,
Age 1 and 2, yeah.
right. Um, it was a small town, I would say. It was populated by farmers and traders, and they had this large water system. Uh, it continued to be occupied in the Persian period and the Hellenistic period. Um, Early Roman, there was a temple there that we have a coin that's minted at Hesperus. It has uh, the name on it, and it pictures a temple with 4 pillars in the front. And we did excavate a Roman temple that has 4 pillars. So, I mean, it's possible that the scene on the coin is something that we actually excavated. Um, and it was uh, quite I would say, a regionally important city in the Hellenistic and Roman period, and into the Byzantine period, where we had 3 churches that we excavated. One of them was really remarkable. It was covered. This church on the north side of the tell was had a large mosaic floor that that actually had been repaired and replaced maybe 3 times, a large floor with a Greek inscription in it, who had provided and so forth. But in the apse was the remains of the altar, and the 4 feet of the altar, the location was evident. But under the altar, there was a circle where there was no mosaic. And so we said, well, let's dig there. We don't want to move the mosaic and destroy it because it was so beautiful, but let's dig where the altar was. And when we went down there, we uncovered there's a large stone with a big square hole in it. And in that hole was a a silver box that had a cross and an alpha and omega on either side. And we took off that the cover of the silver box. There was a human kneecap there, the bones of a knee. So, what was a kneecap in a silver box doing in a large stone hole under the altar of the church? Well, certainly a relic, maybe of a saint or something, and it reminds you of was it the 6th seal in Revelation where it calls out, um, "O Lord, when will you come and rescue us?" And so this must have been a Christian custom, bearing the remains of saints. And then when you came to church, you were reminded of the people whose bones were there, of the waiting for Christ to come, the second coming when they would be resurrected. So we found that custom in this church, in the Byzantine church at Heshbon. So it was never a huge city, but it was a regional city during the classical period, I would say. And then, during Islamic times, it became very important. There was an Islamic school there and a mosque and so forth. But Heshbon was never in the category of a big city like Jerusalem or Amman or Damascus or anything like that. Yeah.
Yes, so let's get back to early period about monarchy beside the pools. By the way, how magnificent were the pools? Is that like Song of Songs said? And yeah, beside that, is there anything else in the time of United Monarchy? Do you see anything?
There was it was mainly waterworks. I mean, we had a other water sources. I'm thinking of one especially that was early Iron Age, but but we didn't find um, houses from that period. We didn't find that the main structures were Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine. That's when we so the Iron Age site we have a lot of good Iron Age pottery and so on, but not a lot of structures other than that large pool. Um, and the that pool was filled up in the Hellenistic period. There was an earthquake which probably destroyed the usefulness of the pool. It would have been maybe too expensive to restore, and so they scraped the top of the mound off and into the pool, so that which was very unusual. When you dig, usually you start with the latest in date, and as you dig, you get earlier. But in the pool, the evidence was turned around. So the the earliest stuff on the top of the mound was in the pool, and then they kept dumping stuff, and so the in the pool it was the reverse of what you usually find, because of that operation.
Sorry,
But
when was the earthquake?
the earthquake was during the Hellenistic period. I forget the exact date, but maybe the second century, something like that. Yeah.
Yes, okay. So, what are the first evidence that we have for Hesbon that city appears? In what century? Yeah.
Yeah, uh I would say the the third the century would be the earliest that we have, other than the pool. Uh I'm not thinking of anything earlier than the third century.
So no
Um,
architecture before third century.
right, right. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So after yeah,
Lots of pottery. So we do know that there were people around. Good Iron Age evidence for pottery, but not for structures.
yes. So after David and all this period, we have in time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, they mention some fields of Hesbon, and
Right.
that's under the control of Moab, and I think Ammon. Yeah,
Uh,
Ammonites. So
Sometimes the
does that
Ammonites,
fit?
yeah,
Mhm.
sometimes the Ammonites, sometimes the Moabites, and they definitely geographically were in the right area, and the the people who owned the area where Heshbon was changed hands from when the Israelites first took it over. Maybe the Reubenites were there, um, but then it was originally Ammonite territory, but Moab came came north, and you have another site that one of our archaeologists from La Sierra is excavating is called Ataruz, and he has it's a biblical site named Atarot in the Old Testament, not far from our site, and he has evidence definitely of a Moabite temple there, and he believes maybe even an Israelite temple. Um, so that has yet to be published or to be announced, but uh, that is something that is a very important find. So to answer your question about the Moabites and the Ammonites, the site definitely changed hands. You know, that region was fought over. Sometimes it was Ammonite, sometimes it was Moabite. During the time that Sihon was there, it was Amorite. Um, but we don't have we don't have a lot of good structures from the Iron Age to comment on.
Yes, and was in that time of Isaiah and Jeremiah, Heshbon agricultural rich and beautiful because it says that the fields will be laid waste, so it
Right,
must
right.
be beautiful.
It was very agriculturally important. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's mentioned so many times in the Hebrew Bible that the memory of Heshbon is a key Israelite datum.
Yes, thank you. So that's it for Heshbon. I now have a question because Madaba playing project that reminds me of the Madaba map. Do you know maybe
Yeah,
about that? Because it mentions Zoar, like Zorah. I don't
right,
know.
right, right.
So what was it? City of Zoar in Bible?
Yeah, uh, the Madaba Plains uh, is a agriculturally very rich area. It wasn't in Old Testament times, continues to be today. And when we were to marry, we did a regional survey uh, with very interesting results. We found agricultural land, including vineyards, that we have evidence for. You know, there's the Song of the Vineyard in Isaiah 5. We have those kinds of vineyards. It's a very fruitful land and still is today. In fact, since we did our work, the whole area is built up with farms and walls and so on. So you couldn't repeat the kind of evidence that we found back in the 70s and 80s when we were working there. Uh, so it's an agriculturally uh, rich in ancient times and continues to be rich today. Um, and on the Madaba map, which you've probably seen, it's in a Byzantine church. Uh, um, you have Zoar there, and I think that the it has been excavated by I think he's a Greek um, archaeologist. And so, as you know, there's some discussion about the location of Sodom, whether it's there in the southeastern part of the Dead Sea or is it north, you know, near Jericho. And there's an American group from New Mexico that argues very strongly that it's north. Uh, I think I think most of the evidence would suggest it's the southeastern part, and Zoar, the cave that's been found, he claims it, is Zoar, and I see no reason to disagree. So I would put Sodom and the cities of the plain down in the southeastern part of the Dead Sea. The Tom Schaub and Walter Rast, excavated places that they thought were Sodom and Gomorrah. And to my mind, that's the most reasonable location, the area where they were excavating.
Yes, I read from Larry Hare article in a magazine, I think Adventist magazine. So he argues that, yeah, it's possible at least to identify those Babedra, Numeira, and other as
Yeah,
cities of flame, maybe.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I would agree. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, Dr. Geraty, I want to finish this interview with asking you, how was it to be director of La Sierra University? Because I really love that university. It's big. I'm proud on that university. But can you tell us your perspective because you were there?
Yeah, yeah. It's been a privilege to be here. I was not looking for the job, but I was president at Atlantic Union College in Massachusetts in 1993 when the university came looking, and they interviewed me and asked me to come, and I agreed. Um, at that time, uh, it had been a part of Loma Linda University. Uh, Loma Linda University, which, as you probably know, is primarily medical, dental, and health university. And that was established 1905. Our university was established 1922 as an independent liberal arts university. And in 1975, the accrediting body told Loma Linda that they would lose their accreditation if they didn't have an undergraduate program to support their professional programs. And so rather than build a new undergraduate program, they said, down the road, we have La Sierra. Why don't we combine them into the same institution? And La Sierra will be our undergraduate program. And that worked fine for 25 years, but the what should I say, the customs on the two campuses are quite different. In Loma Linda, they're professionals, they're working on their medical, dental degrees and so on. The faculty there are into their research. If the administration says to the faculty, jump, at Loma Linda, they would say, how high? At La Sierra, if you tell the faculty, jump, they would say, why would we do that? Give us reasons. La Sierra the faculty are very involved in faculty governance of the institution. And so the customs, the spirit of the two campuses are quite different. And there were problems between the two campuses that developed. So they decided to separate them after 25 years. And Loma Linda no longer needed the undergraduate program as the accrediting body had told them they had to. And so now the two institutions are doing well separately. Anyway, at the separation, they wanted, to renew the work at La Sierra. And when I came, we had an $8 million deficit, and so there were definitely challenges in trying to get a hold of but we had several hundred acres of farmland, and they had closed the farm, and it was costing us money just to keep the weeds down on the farm. And so my thought was, let's develop that land and make it an income producing asset rather than giving us the problems, just trying to keep the weeds down. So we extended the campus of the university. We all the land around, immediately contiguous to the university, we leased for 90 years. And so the people who purchased the lease built apartment buildings mostly around us. And in 90 years, all of that land would come back to La Sierra, and including all the improvements on the land, the buildings and so on, and to become ours. Well, that was 20 years ago, so now it's 70 years from now that will come back to the university. In the meantime, we get annual subsidies from the people who built those apartments, and we get a cut on the rents. So when I left my job, 2007, we had a $100 million endowment and no debt. And it came from the development of this land. The farther area we sold also. So it has provided a very good source of material, a source of finances during some difficult financial times. And La Sierra has, I would say, prospered as a result, even during the times when we had COVID and so forth. So it has been a rewarding opportunity to make a difference at this institution. And we now have a new president who was the provost at Andrews University. He just came to us a year ago, and we're experiencing, I would say, a kind of a rebirth right now. And there's optimism, and we have 4 schools. We have the College of Arts and Sciences, and a lot of students come here to get their undergraduate biology, physics degrees, and so on in preparation for going into medicine, dentistry at Loma Linda. But we have an excellent School of Business, which is doing a great job. So we have arts and science, business, a divinity school, which offers an MDiv program, as well as master's programs. And then we have a School of Education up through a doctorate, preparing teachers. So those 4 schools are strong and doing well. So I look back and feel rewarded for what I was able to do, with a lot of help, of course, from a lot of people.
Amazing work, and I'm really proud on La Sierra, so cannot hide that. So what do you think about the spirit of that university? There was a controversy about evolution, and do you think that we should be more conservative or liberal? Do we need more freedom or more spirituality? So some thoughts on that.
I would say, and that problem came after my time. My successor had to deal with that, and I believe I would have dealt with it somewhat differently from what he did, but he did his best. We all do our best. I would say that we have to give credence to scientific research. That doesn't mean we always get everything right, but we have to take it seriously. The research that has been done in various scientific fields, which and I mean, evolution definitely takes place, and we have to recognize that. I mean, we have to prepare our students to get into scientific programs at Loma Linda. If we didn't teach evolution, they would not be able to get into those programs. That doesn't mean that evolution has the answer to the origin of human beings, but we do see change taking place in our world, and we have to take our science seriously. And I don't believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the upper reaches is doing that. They've established a the Geoscience Research Institute and have spent millions of dollars, but still haven't come up with any explanation that supports the traditional views. They've done their best. So I think that the church needs its universities and its scientists to help it come to terms with what we know about the history of the world and how science helps us to understand how things work. So the Bible, I accept the Bible, the history that we learn about in the Bible, I accept that. The dating can be a problem. But the Bible is given to us for not to answer questions about history and how things work. It is given to us for where we came from, where we're going, and our spiritual existence. So we Adventists need to take science seriously, but we also, I'm a creator in terms of origins. I believe God created us, but we also have to see that evolution has played a part in how God has created. So the future of Adventism, I think, will remain strong if we incorporate scientific discoveries along with our traditional views that we've gotten from Scripture.
Yes, I agree totally. Thank you so much, Professor Geraty. And for the conclusion of all this, can you say what keeps you faithful? It is much easier to be Christian when you know less. You think everything is proven, maybe. And when you find out those things like Heshbon, you don't have anything from the time of Moses. And so how is it hard for you to stay faithful despite all those things?
Sure. Well, I think that I mean the Bible is very important as a guide for life and how we treat one another and the kind of interactions we have with people. So to me, Christianity and its values teach me the kind of person I should be and what my commitments are, and how I treat my fellow man. In Matthew 25, we have what Jesus told us about in the judgment. He's not going to ask us what we believe. He's going to ask us how we treated our fellow human beings. And so my religion and my environment teaches me those values, and that's important. And when it comes to science and history, there's room for study and for change and for development. But my values, my destiny comes out of Scripture.
Beautiful conclusion. Thank you so much, Professor Geraty, for sharing your insights on Exodus, on Heshbon, archaeology of Jordan, and anything other. So, dear audience, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time, and as always, greetings from Serbia.
Thank you so much. Good talking with you. Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.
Thank you.